On Mother's Day, my daughter gifted her mother-in-law a $20,000 necklace and raised a toast. I wish you were my real mom. I only got the mortgage bill. Pay by Monday. I smiled. 2 hours later, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I'm 64 years old, and I thought I'd seen enough of life's cruelties to be prepared for anything. I was wrong. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened on Mother's Day, sitting in my own dining room, watching my daughter Celine present a $20,000 necklace to her mother-in-law, while I received a mortgage bill with a sticky note that read, "Pay by Monday." The morning started like any other Mother's Day for the past 5 years. Celine called around 9, her voice artificially sweet in that way that always made my stomach clench. "Mom, we're having brunch at our place. Patricia will be there too." Patricia is her mother-in-law, though Celine rarely calls her that anymore. It's always Patricia this and Patricia that, like she's speaking about some beloved mentor rather than her husband's mother. I drove to their house, the house I've been paying the mortgage on for 3 years now, though Celine tells everyone they bought it themselves. The neighborhood is one of those picture-perfect developments where every lawn looks like it belongs in a magazine, and every driveway has cars worth more than most people make in a year. I pulled up in my 10-year-old Honda, feeling the familiar weight of not belonging in the world my own daughter inhabits. Marcus, my son-in-law, greeted me at the door with his usual polite smile that never quite reaches his eyes. "Happy Mother's Day, Blanche," he said, taking my coat. Behind him, I could hear Celine's laughter mixing with Patricia's, that particular sound of women who share secrets and inside jokes. The sound hit me like a physical blow because I couldn't remember the last time Celine laughed that way with me. The dining room was set with their expensive china, the kind that costs more per plate than I spend on groceries in a week. Fresh flowers adorned the table, white roses and baby's breath, Patricia's favorites, as I'd learned over the years. Everything was perfect, elegant, designed to impress. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot that somehow always felt like an afterthought. Patricia arrived fashionably late, as she always does. She's one of those women who ages gracefully because she can afford to. Regular facials, expensive haircuts, clothes that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Celine practically glowed when she walked in, jumping up to embrace her like a daughter greeting her beloved mother. "Patricia, you look amazing," Celine gushed, adjusting Patricia's scarf with the kind of tender attention she used to give me when she was small. "I have something special for you today." I watched this exchange with the hollow feeling I'd grown accustomed to, the sensation of being invisible in my own daughter's life. Marcus poured mimosas while Celine disappeared into another room, returning with an elegant gift box that made my heart sink. I recognized that particular shade of blue from Tiffany's, and I had a sick feeling about what was coming. "Patricia, you've been such an incredible mother figure to me," Celine began, her voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever could have asked for. You've shown me what unconditional love really looks like." The words hit me like a slap. Unconditional love. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up with her when she had pneumonia at age 7, the way I'd worked double shifts to pay for her dance lessons, the college tuition I'd scraped together by selling my mother's jewelry. But apparently, that wasn't unconditional enough. Patricia opened the box with delicate fingers, and even from my end of the table I could see the flash of diamonds. A necklace, beautiful and expensive, the kind of gift that speaks of deep appreciation and love. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, real tears, not the crocodile variety. "Oh, Celine," she whispered, "it's absolutely beautiful." But Celine wasn't finished. She raised her mimosa glass, and I watched with growing dread as everyone else followed suit. Everyone except me. I couldn't move. "I want to make a toast," Celine announced, her voice carrying across the room like a verdict. "To Patricia, the woman who showed me what it really means to be a mother. I wish you could have been my real mother." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt my face flush hot, then cold, as if all the blood had drained from my body at once. Patricia looked uncomfortable for a split second, glancing in my direction. but Celine was beaming at her with such genuine affection that the moment passed. Marcus cleared his throat and mumbled something about love coming in many forms, but his words felt hollow, obligatory. I sat there, frozen, as they clinked glasses and moved on to discussing Patricia's upcoming trip to Italy, the conversation flowing around me like I wasn't even there. That's when Celine reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "Oh, Mom," she said, finally acknowledging my presence. "I almost forgot. Could you take care of this by Monday? Thanks." She slid the envelope across the table without even looking at me properly. Inside was the mortgage statement for their house that I've been paying for, month after month, because Celine claimed they were temporarily tight after Marcus's job change 3 years ago. The sticky note on top, written in Celine's careless scrawl, simply said, "Pay by Monday." I stared at that piece of paper while the conversation continued around me. $20,000 for a necklace, but I get handed a bill like I'm some kind of personal bank. The irony wasn't lost on me that on Mother's Day, I was being treated less like a mother and more like a financial institution. Something shifted inside me in that moment. Maybe it was the way Celine avoided my eyes when she handed me the bill, or the way Patricia kept admiring her necklace while I sat there with mortgage paperwork. Maybe it was just the accumulation of 5 years of being treated like a necessary inconvenience in my own daughter's life. I folded the mortgage statement carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I smiled. Not the forced smile I'd been wearing for years, but something else entirely. Something that felt dangerous and free at the same time. "Of course, sweetheart," I said quietly. "I'll take care of it." But as I sat there watching my daughter fawn over her mother-in-law, I was already making plans. Plans I'd been considering for months, but never had the courage to execute. Plans that would change everything. I excused myself to use the bathroom and pulled out my phone. My fingers shook slightly as I scrolled through my contacts and found the number I'd saved but never called. Robert Kellerman, attorney at law. The consultation I'd been putting off for 6 months suddenly felt urgent. I typed a simple message. "I'm ready to discuss those documents we talked about. Can you meet tomorrow?" His reply came within minutes. "Of course. My office at 2 p.m. I deleted both messages, slipped my phone back into my purse, and returned to the dining room where my daughter was still lavishing attention on the woman she wished was her real mother. I had been building a case for 3 years, documenting everything, saving every receipt, every demanding text message, every dismissive comment. I'd been hoping things would change, that Celine would remember who had actually raised her, who had actually sacrificed for her. But sitting there on Mother's Day, being handed a mortgage bill while watching my daughter give a $20,000 necklace to someone else, I realized that hope had been foolish. It was time to stop hoping and start acting. The next afternoon, I sat in Robert Kellerman's office, a manila folder thick with 3 years of documentation spread across his mahogany desk. The lawyer, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and silver hair, examined each piece of evidence with the careful attention of someone who'd seen too many family tragedies play out in legal documents. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, using my maiden name as I'd requested, "this is quite comprehensive. You've documented everything. Mortgage payments, utility bills, car payments, even grocery receipts." I watched him flip through the financial records, my throat tight with the memory of gathering each piece of evidence. "I started keeping track after the first year," I explained. Something in my gut told me this wasn't temporary like Celine claimed. Robert paused on a particular bank statement, his eyebrows raising slightly. "You've paid their mortgage for 36 consecutive months. That's over $200,000. The number hung in the air between us like an accusation. $200,000. More than twice what my late husband left me. Money I'd stretched by living in a tiny apartment and driving a car older than some of my neighbors' children. And this is the deed to the property," he continued, holding up the document that I'd retrieved from my safety deposit box that morning. "You're listed as co-owner." I nodded, remembering the day 3 years ago when Celine had convinced me to co-sign for the house. "Just temporarily, Mom," she'd said. Until Marcus's credit improves. She'd promised it would only be for 6 months. She'd promised a lot of things. "Mrs. Morrison?" Robert said gently. Are you aware that legally you have as much right to this property as your daughter does? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I suspected, but I wasn't sure. He set the deed aside and picked up another document, one that made my hands tremble every time I looked at it. And this power of attorney agreement that your daughter had you sign last year? She said it was just in case something happened to me, I whispered, so she could handle my affairs if I got sick. Robert's expression darkened. Mrs. Morrison, this document gives her complete control over your finances, your medical decisions, even your living arrangements. Combined with some of these text messages you've shown me. He trailed off, selecting a printout from the pile. I didn't need to look to know which messages he was referring to, the ones from 6 months ago, when Celine had started suggesting I might be getting confused about money, when she'd mentioned assisted living facilities, claiming she was worried about my mental state, when she'd started treating me like I was already incompetent. The pattern is concerning, Robert continued. The financial dependency she's created, the legal documents she's had you sign, the documented instances of her questioning your mental capacity. If I didn't know better, I'd say someone was building a case for guardianship. My blood ran cold. Guardianship meant Celine would have complete control over my life, my money, my decisions. It meant I'd become a ward of my own daughter, with no more rights than a child. She wouldn't, I started to say, but the words died in my throat. Wouldn't she? The daughter who handed me mortgage bills on Mother's Day while giving $20,000 gifts to her mother-in-law? Robert leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand something. If your daughter files for guardianship and points to these financial arrangements as evidence that you're being taken advantage of by unscrupulous people, it could look very bad for you. Especially if she claims you're giving away large sums of money to people who are manipulating you. The irony was staggering. Celine could paint me as a victim of financial abuse while she was the one doing the abusing. She could claim she was protecting me from people taking advantage of my generosity while she was the one with her hand in my bank account. What are my options? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Robert organized the papers into neat stacks. Several. First, we can revoke the power of attorney immediately. Second, we can establish clear boundaries around the property and financial arrangements. Third, he paused, studying my face. We can go on the offensive. What do you mean? You have documented evidence of financial exploitation spanning 3 years. You have proof that your daughter has been living far beyond her means at your expense, while lying to others about her financial independence. If we wanted to, we could file charges. I thought about Patricia's beautiful necklace, about the way Celine's face had glowed when she called her the mother she wished she'd had. I thought about years of being taken for granted, of being treated like a human ATM, of watching my daughter build a life of lies funded by my sacrifice. I don't want to send her to jail, I said finally. I just want her to understand what she's done. I want her to face consequences. Robert nodded thoughtfully. There are other ways to achieve that. We could start by asserting your legal rights to the property. Since you're co-owner and you've been making the payments, you have every right to adjust the arrangement. I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in years. Power, control, the ability to make choices instead of just reacting to other people's demands. I've also been keeping audio recordings, I admitted quietly. Robert's head snapped up. Recordings? I reached into my purse and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind elderly people use to record doctor's appointments so they don't forget important information. I started recording our conversations about 6 months ago, when she began talking about my mental state. I wanted to have proof of what was actually said in case she tried to claim you were confused or incompetent, Robert finished. I nodded. There are some difficult conversations on there. Robert held out his hand. May I listen? I handed him the device with shaking fingers. He plugged in earphones and scrolled through the files, listening to snippets of conversations that had torn my heart out when they happened. I watched his face change as he heard Celine's voice, sometimes sweetly manipulative, sometimes coldly dismissive, sometimes openly contemptuous. When he finally removed the earphones, his expression was grim. Mrs. Morrison, These recordings document a clear pattern of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. There are several instances where your daughter explicitly discusses your alleged mental decline in ways that sound rehearsed, like she's building a narrative. My worst fears were confirmed. Celine hadn't just been using me financially, she'd been preparing to have me declared incompetent so she could control me completely. "What happens now?" I asked. Robert began organizing the documents into a neat stack. "Now we turn the tables. Instead of waiting for her to make her move, we make ours. We revoke the power of attorney. We establish your legal rights to the property, and we make it very clear that any attempt to question your mental capacity will be met with evidence of her own behavior." He paused, fixing me with a serious look. "But Mrs. Morrison, once we start this process, there's no going back. Your relationship with your daughter will never be the same." I thought about Mother's Day, about the mortgage bill, about years of being treated like a necessary burden. "It's already not the same," I said quietly. "She just doesn't know it yet." As I left Robert's office that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not hope that Celine would change, not hope that she'd suddenly appreciate me, but hope that I could finally stop being a victim of her selfishness. I had spent 3 years documenting my own exploitation, and now I had a plan to use that documentation to reclaim my life. The plan I'd been preparing, without even realizing it, for 3 long years. The first step was revoking the power of attorney, which Robert handled with the efficiency of someone who'd seen too many elderly people sign away their rights to manipulative family members. The document was filed on Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, I was no longer legally under my daughter's potential control. The second step was harder. I had to stop enabling her. Wednesday morning, I called the mortgage company and had my automatic payment stopped. 3 years of never missing a payment, and suddenly the safety net Celine had grown so comfortable with was gone. I also called the utility companies, the car payment company, and every other monthly expense I'd been covering for their household. I didn't tell Celine what I'd done. I wanted to see how long it would take her to notice that her free ride had ended. It took exactly 11 days. My phone rang at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, Celine's name flashing on the screen with an urgency that made my heart race despite everything. For a moment, the mother in me panicked. What if something was wrong? What if she or Marcus was hurt? "Mom?" Her voice was tight with stress. "There's been some kind of mistake with the mortgage payment. The company called saying we're late, but that's impossible since you always handle it." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste along with the moment I'd been waiting for. "I stopped the automatic payment," I said calmly. Silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. "You... what?" "I stopped paying your bills, Celine. All of them." Her voice pitched higher, taking on that edge of panic I hadn't heard since she was 16 and had crashed my car. "Mom, you can't just stop paying them. We have agreements. We have arrangements." "Arrangements that were supposed to be temporary," I replied evenly. "It's been 3 years. I think it's time you and Marcus handled your own responsibilities." I could hear her breathing quicken, and I pictured her pacing around the kitchen of the house I'd been financing, her manicured nails, also paid for by me, drumming against the granite countertops that had been part of the essential renovations last year. "Mom, this isn't funny. We can't just suddenly take on all these payments. Marcus's salary doesn't cover everything." "Then perhaps you shouldn't have bought a house you couldn't afford," I said, surprised by how steady my voice remained. 3 years of practiced submission, and suddenly I was finding my backbone. "We need to talk about this in person," Celine said, her tone shifting to that manipulative sweetness I'd grown to recognize. "Why don't I come over tonight? We can discuss this rationally." "Of course, sweetheart. I'll make dinner." After I hung up, I retrieved the small digital recorder from my purse and checked the battery. Tonight's conversation was definitely going to be worth documenting. Celine arrived at 6:30, letting herself into my apartment with the key I'd given her years ago, the same key I'd been planning to ask for back. She looked perfectly put together as always, but I could see the stress lines around her eyes, the tight set of her shoulders. "Mom, she said, settling onto my couch with the grace of someone accustomed to making herself comfortable in other people's spaces. We need to talk about what's happening. I handed her a glass of wine, the expensive kind she'd trained me to buy for her visits, and sat across from her in my armchair. What would you like to discuss? This sudden decision to stop helping us financially. It's so unlike you, and frankly, I'm concerned. She took a delicate sip of wine, her eyes studying my face with the calculated attention of someone looking for weakness. Have you been feeling all right lately? Confused about things? There it was. The opening move in what I now realized had been a long-planned chess game. Paint Mom as mentally declining, unable to make rational financial decisions, in need of protection from herself. I feel perfectly clear, I said calmly. Clear enough to realize that I've been taken advantage of for 3 years. Celine's expression shifted, the concerned daughter mask slipping slightly. Taken advantage of? Mom, we never asked you to pay our bills. You offered. I offered to help temporarily while Marcus transitioned to his new job. That was 3 years ago. These things take time, she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. Marcus is building his career. We're investing in our future. With my money. She set down her wine glass harder than necessary. It's not like you're struggling financially. You live in this tiny apartment. You drive that old car. You don't even spend money on yourself. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I was being selfish for wanting to keep my own money instead of funding her lifestyle. I was being unreasonable for not wanting to live like a pauper so she could live like a princess. Celine, I said quietly, do you remember Mother's Day? Her face flushed slightly. What about it? You gave Patricia a $20,000 necklace. So? You handed me a mortgage bill. She had the grace to look uncomfortable for about 3 seconds before the defensiveness kicked in. Patricia has been incredibly good to me, Mom. She treats me like a real daughter. The words hit their intended target. I felt the familiar sting, the old wound being prodded and poked. But this time, instead of retreating into hurt silence, I felt something else. Clarity. And what do I treat you like, Celine? She hesitated, perhaps realizing she'd revealed more than she intended. You treat me like I owe you something for everything you've done for me. Everything I've done for you, I repeated slowly. You mean like raising you alone after your father died? Like working 2 jobs to pay for your dance lessons and cheerleading in college? Like selling my mother's jewelry to cover your graduation expenses? Like paying your mortgage for 3 years? I never asked you to do any of that, she snapped, and there it was. The mask completely off now, the real Celine emerging. Those were your choices, your decisions. You don't get to hold them over my head forever. I reached into my purse and pulled out the digital recorder, setting it on the coffee table between us. Her eyes fixed on it immediately, and I watched her face drain of color. How long have you been recording our conversations? She whispered. 6 months, I said calmly, since you started suggesting I might need help managing my affairs. She stared at the device like it was a snake coiled to strike. That's illegal. Actually, it's not. This is a one-party consent state, which means I can record any conversation I'm part of without your permission. The legal terminology Robert had taught me rolled off my tongue with an authority that surprised us both. Celine's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You've been planning this, she said, and for the first time, I heard something I'd never heard in my daughter's voice when speaking to me. Respect, or maybe it was fear. No, Celine, I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back, her wine forgotten. You can't just cut us off, Mom. We have obligations, commitments. The mortgage company won't care about your hurt feelings. Then I suggest you figure out how to pay your own bills. She whirled around, her face contorted with anger. Fine. You want to play hardball? I've been talking to a lawyer too. About your mental state. About your capacity to make financial decisions. Do you know what it looks like when an elderly woman gives away hundreds of thousands of dollars? It looks like exploitation. The threat was finally out in the open, the game she'd been playing revealed in all its ugliness. But instead of the fear she was expecting to see, I smiled. Gives away money to whom, Celine? She blinked, confused by my reaction. You said it looks like exploitation when an elderly woman gives away money. Who exactly would I be giving it away to? You? My own daughter? Who's been manipulating me into paying her bills while she spends $20,000 on jewelry for other people? I watched comprehension dawn on her face as she realized the trap she'd built for me had suddenly become a trap for herself. Any lawyer you talk to will want to see financial records, I continued. They'll want to know where my money has been going. And when they see 3 years of mortgage payments, car payments, and credit card bills for a daughter who was simultaneously telling people she was financially independent, well, I shrugged. I wonder what that will look like. Celine sank back onto the couch, her face pale. For the first time in years, she was looking at me like I was someone to be reckoned with instead of someone to be managed. What do you want? She asked quietly. I picked up the recorder and turned it off, the small click echoing in the sudden silence. I want you to leave. She stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. Leave? I want you to go home to your husband and your house and your life, and I want you to figure out how to pay for it yourself. I want you to stop treating me like your personal bank account and start treating me like your mother. Celine grabbed her purse, her movements sharp and angry. This isn't over, Mom. Yes, I said quietly. It is. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment, listening to the sound of my own breathing and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The trap had closed, but not around me, around the person who had spent 3 years trying to catch me in it. The call came at 8 in the morning, exactly 1 week after Celine had stormed out of my apartment. Patricia's voice was crisp and controlled, the way wealthy women sound when they're trying to manage an unpleasant situation. Blanche, I think we need to meet. There are some things about Celine's situation that I believe you should be aware of. My stomach clenched. Had Celine convinced Patricia that I was the problem? Had she spun some story about her mentally declining mother who was endangering the family's financial stability? Of course, I said carefully. When and where? Today, if possible. My home, and Blanche. Patricia's voice softened slightly. I think you should bring any documentation you have regarding your financial arrangements with Celine and Marcus. The way she said documentation made my pulse quicken. This wasn't a social call or an intervention. This was something else entirely. I arrived at Patricia's house that afternoon with a folder full of bank statements, mortgage documents, and my digital recorder. The Cromwell estate was everything Celine aspired to. Old money elegance, perfectly manicured grounds, the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. Patricia met me at the door herself, dressed in a simple but expensive sweater set that probably cost more than my monthly rent. But her usual polished composure was strained, and I could see stress lines around her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Thank you for coming," she said, leading me into a sitting room that belonged in a magazine. "Can I offer you tea? Coffee? Tea would be nice." She poured from an antique silver service, her hands steady despite whatever was troubling her. We sat in the kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken words, both of us knowing this conversation was going to change things. "Blanche," Patricia began, setting down her teacup with deliberate care. "Celine came to see me 3 days ago. She was quite upset about your decision to stop helping them financially." Here it comes, I thought. The part where Patricia explains that I'm being unreasonable, that family should stick together, that Celine is just a young woman trying to build a life. "She asked me to intervene," Patricia continued, "to talk to you about reconsidering your position." I nodded, waiting for the lecture about family obligations and forgiveness. Instead, Patricia reached for a manila folder that had been sitting on the side table. But before I agreed to anything, I asked Celine some questions about their financial situation. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of help they'd been receiving from you. She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "Blanche, were you aware that 3 months ago, Celine and Marcus applied for a home equity loan against the house you've been paying for?" My blood went cold. "What?" "A loan for $150,000, Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. They used the equity you've been building with your mortgage payments as collateral for additional debt. I stared at the paperwork, the numbers swimming before my eyes. They had been using my payments to build equity in a house, then borrowing against that equity for more money. It was like a scheme within a scheme. "There's more," Patricia said grimly. She pulled out credit card statements that made my stomach lurch. "Celine has been charging significant expenses to accounts that Marcus and I co-signed for when they were first married. Expenses she told me were necessary household items and emergency repairs." I looked at the statements. $20,000 to a jewelry store. $15,000 to a luxury resort in Maui. $8,000 to a spa and wellness center. These weren't household necessities or emergency repairs. These were the purchases of someone living a fantasy lifestyle funded by other people's money. "The necklace," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "The one she gave you for Mother's Day." Patricia's face crumpled slightly. I had no idea she'd spent that much money on it, or that she was charging it to an account I was liable for. She paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Blanche, I think my son's wife has been stealing from both of us." The word hung in the air like a physical presence, stealing, not just manipulating or taking advantage, but actual theft, from her own mother and her mother-in-law. "There's something else," Patricia continued, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she reached for another document. "Last week, Celine came to me with a proposal. She said you were becoming confused and forgetful, that you were making poor financial decisions and needed guidance." My throat went dry. "What kind of guidance?" "She suggested that Marcus and I might need to step in to help manage your affairs. She had papers with her, something about a conservatorship arrangement that would allow them to make financial decisions on your behalf." The room seemed to spin around me. A conservatorship, legal control over every aspect of my life. The ultimate conclusion of the long game Celine had been playing. "She told me you'd been giving away large sums of money to strangers," Patricia continued, "and that she was worried you were being taken advantage of by scammers." I let out a bitter laugh. "The only person taking advantage of me has been your daughter-in-law." Patricia nodded grimly. That became very clear when I started asking for specifics. When I pressed her for details about these alleged scams, she became evasive. When I asked to see documentation of your mental decline, she claimed you'd hidden it from her. She pulled out one final document. "So, I hired a private investigator to look into your financial situation." My eyes widened. "You what?" I needed to know the truth before I agreed to anything. "What I found." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Blanche, for the past 3 years, 90% of your income has gone to supporting Celine and Marcus. You've been living on less than your Social Security check while they've been living like millionaires." The private investigator's report was thorough and damning. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every credit card payment I'd made on their behalf was documented. But more than that, it showed the timeline of Selena's spending escalating dramatically once she realized I would pay for anything she claimed was necessary. "There's something else I need to show you," Patricia said, her voice barely audible. She pulled out a small digital recorder, similar to mine. I recorded our conversation when she came to me about the conservatorship. My hands shook as I listened to my daughter's voice, cold and calculating, describing me as a confused old woman who needed to be protected from her own poor judgment. But worse than that was hearing her discuss the financial benefits of controlling my assets. "Once we have legal control," Celine's voice came through the speaker, "we can consolidate her resources with ours. She doesn't need that much money anyway. She's perfectly happy living in that little apartment." Patricia stopped the recording. "She wasn't trying to protect you, Blanche. She was trying to rob you legally." I sat in stunned silence, the full scope of my daughter's betrayal washing over me. This wasn't just about mortgage payments or credit card bills. This was about taking control of my entire life, turning me into a legal dependent so she could access not just my monthly income, but my savings, my investments, everything I had left from my late husband's life insurance. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Patricia's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. The look of a wealthy woman who'd been crossed and was preparing to use every resource at her disposal for retaliation. "Now, we call Marcus." An hour later, Marcus sat in his mother's living room, his face cycling through confusion, denial, and finally, devastation, as Patricia laid out the evidence of his wife's systematic theft and deception. I watched this man I'd known for 8 years discover that his marriage was built on lies and fraud. "The jewelry store receipts," he said numbly, staring at the credit card statements. "She told me those were gifts for you, Mom. Anniversary presents and birthday gifts." $20,000 worth? Patricia asked coolly. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands. "She said you insisted on expensive things. She said you had refined tastes and wouldn't be happy with anything less." I watched him piece together 3 years of lies, seeing his wife's manipulation for what it really was. The woman he thought he'd married, loving, generous, devoted to family, was actually a calculating thief who'd been using both our love against us. "The house," he whispered. "The mortgage payments. She told me your mother was helping temporarily, that it was her idea because she wanted us to have a good start." "It was supposed to be temporary," I said gently. 6 months, maybe a year. Marcus looked at me with eyes full of shame and regret. "She's been lying to everyone. To you, to Mom, to me." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "The home equity loan. She told me we needed it for repairs, but we never did any repairs." Patricia and I exchanged glances. We both knew where that money had gone, into funding a lifestyle that neither of us had agreed to support. "There's going to be a reckoning," Patricia said quietly. "Marcus, you need to decide what you're going to do about your wife. Because what she's done isn't just morally wrong, it's criminal." As I sat in that elegant living room, surrounded by evidence of my daughter's betrayal, I realized that the trap she'd been building for me had finally snapped shut. But she was the one caught in it. The confrontation happened on a Wednesday evening, in the same dining room where Celine had handed me that mortgage bill on Mother's Day. But this time, the power dynamic was completely reversed. Patricia had insisted on hosting the meeting at Celine and Marcus's house, the house I'd been paying for. "She needs to face this in the place where she's been living her lie," Patricia had said. And I understood the symbolism. Every room in that house represented money that had come from my account, sacrifices I'd made so she could play at being wealthy. I arrived with Robert, my lawyer, and a folder containing 3 years of documented evidence. Patricia came with her own attorney, a stern woman named Catherine Walsh who specialized in financial crimes. Marcus was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, looking like a man who'd discovered his entire life was built on quicksand. Celine walked in from the garage carrying shopping bags from Nordstrom, her face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who'd just spent money she didn't have. She stopped short when she saw all of us gathered in her kitchen, her smile faltering as she took in the serious expressions and legal folders. "What's going on?" she asked, but I could hear the underlying tension in her voice. She knew. On some level, she'd always known this moment would come. "Sit down, Celine," Marcus said quietly, not meeting her eyes. She remained standing, clutching her shopping bags like shields. "Why is everyone here? Why do you all look like someone died?" Patricia spoke first, her voice calm but deadly. "We need to discuss your financial arrangements, dear. All of them." I watched Celine's face cycle through emotions, confusion, irritation, and then the first flicker of real fear as she noticed the lawyers. "I don't understand what you mean," she said, but her voice had lost its usual confidence. Catherine Walsh opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "Mrs. Cromwell, we have documentation showing that over the past 3 years, you've received approximately $240,000 from your mother-in-law and mother combined, while simultaneously running up an additional $150,000 in debt using fraudulent representations." Celine's shopping bags hit the floor. "Fraudulent representations? That's ridiculous. I never committed fraud." Robert leaned forward. "Mrs. Cromwell, you signed documents stating that you and your husband were financially capable of handling a mortgage when you knew your mother was making the payments. You applied for credit cards using your mother-in-law as a guarantor, while representing household expenses that were actually luxury purchases. You attempted to initiate conservatorship proceedings against your mother based on fabricated claims of mental incompetence." I watched my daughter's face drain of color as the full scope of her legal exposure became clear. These weren't just family disagreements or moral failings. These were crimes. "You don't understand," Celine said, her voice rising with panic. My mother offered to help. Patricia co-signed for those accounts. Nobody forced anyone to do anything. Under false pretenses, Catherine replied coolly. You told Mrs. Morrison the financial assistance was temporary, while telling Mrs. Cromwell that the credit charges were for necessities. You misrepresented the nature and scope of the assistance to both parties. Marcus finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Disgust. Celine, they have recordings. Recordings of you planning to have your mother declared incompetent so you could control her money. The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Selena's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in her adult life, she had no quick explanation, no charming deflection, no way to manipulate the situation to her advantage. That's not what I was doing, she whispered finally. I was trying to protect her. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 64 years, but also feeling stronger than I had in decades. Protect me from what, Celine? She turned to me with eyes that suddenly looked very young and very frightened. From making bad decisions. From people taking advantage of you. People like you? The question seemed to shatter something inside her. She sank into a chair, her perfect composure finally cracking. I never meant for it to go this far. It was supposed to be temporary, just until we got on our feet. 3 years, I said quietly. 3 years of lying to me, lying to Marcus, lying to Patricia. 3 years of spending money you didn't have while telling me you needed help with basic expenses. Patricia placed a credit card statement on the table. $20,000 at a jewelry store, Celine, for a necklace you gave me while your mother received a mortgage bill. $15,000 for a vacation to Maui, Robert added, consulting his notes. Charged to an account guaranteed by Mrs. Cromwell while you told your mother you couldn't afford groceries. Each revelation was like a slap. I watched Celine shrink into herself as the full scope of her deception was laid bare. But what struck me most was that she still didn't look sorry. She looked caught. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I can't do this anymore. Celine's head snapped up. What do you mean? I mean, I can't be married to someone who would steal from her own mother, who would try to have her declared incompetent for money. His voice broke slightly. Who made me complicit in robbing the 2 women who've been kindest to me in my life? Marcus, you don't understand the pressure I've been under, Celine pleaded. Everyone expects so much from us. Your mother's friends, my old college friends. I just wanted us to fit in. By stealing? Marcus's voice was raw with pain. By lying to everyone who loved us? Catherine Walsh cleared her throat. Mr. Cromwell, given the evidence we've compiled, you need to make some decisions about your own legal exposure. You signed some of these documents. You benefited from the fraudulent arrangements. I watched Marcus's face go pale as he realized he might be criminally liable for his wife's schemes. I didn't know, he said desperately. I swear to God, I thought my mother was helping because she wanted to. I thought Blanche was contributing because she loved Celine. Ignorance isn't always a defense, Catherine replied, but cooperation can be a mitigating factor. The room fell silent as the implications settled over everyone. Celine was facing serious criminal charges. Marcus might be charged as an accessory. Their marriage was over. The life they'd built on lies and stolen money was collapsing. What do you want? Celine asked finally, looking directly at me for the first time. What do you want me to do? I studied my daughter's face, searching for some sign of genuine remorse, some indication that she understood the magnitude of what she'd done to the people who loved her. But all I saw was fear and calculation, the same look she'd had as a teenager when she'd been caught in a lie and was trying to figure out how to minimize the consequences. I want you to face the truth, I said quietly. I want you to stop lying, stop manipulating, stop taking advantage of people who care about you. And legally? Robert prompted. I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. Patricia, who'd been betrayed by the daughter-in-law she'd treated like her own child. Marcus, whose marriage and possibly his freedom hung in the balance. Catherine and Robert, waiting for my decision about whether to pursue criminal charges. Legally, I said slowly, I want full restitution of the money that was taken under false pretenses. I want the house sold and the proceeds used to pay back what's owed. I want a formal acknowledgement of the fraud that's taken place. Celine's face crumpled. That's everything. The house, the cars, all of it. We'll have nothing. You'll have what you had before you started stealing from your family, I replied. You'll have what you can actually afford. Patricia nodded grimly. I'm pursuing criminal charges for the credit card fraud. What Celine did to me wasn't just morally wrong, it was theft. Marcus looked at his wife with eyes full of pain and disappointment. I'm filing for divorce, Celine. I can't stay married to someone who would do this to people I love. I watched my daughter's carefully constructed world collapse around her like a house of cards in a strong wind. The money was gone. The marriage was over. The lifestyle she'd fought so hard to maintain was disappearing. But as I sat there watching her face the consequences of her choices, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not satisfaction or revenge, but a deep, quiet peace that came from finally standing up for myself. I'm going home, I said, gathering my purse and coat. Celine, when you're ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship, not about money, not about what you need from me, but about how you've treated the person who raised you, you know where to find me. As I walked out of that house for the last time, I heard Celine calling my name, her voice desperate and panicked. But I didn't turn around. The daughter I'd raised was gone, had been gone for years. The woman behind me was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, and I was finally done pretending otherwise. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch of my new cottage in Asheville, North Carolina, watching the morning mist rise from the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and possibilities. For the first time in years, I was living in a space that was truly mine, paid for with money that hadn't been siphoned away to support someone else's lies. The cottage was small but perfect. 2 bedrooms, a cozy kitchen with a window overlooking the garden, and a front porch where I could drink my coffee while watching the world wake up. It cost less per month than I'd been spending on Celine's mortgage, and every payment was mine to make. The restitution process had taken 4 months to complete. The house in Sacramento sold quickly. Apparently, homes in good neighborhoods always do, especially when they're priced to move fast. After paying off the mortgages and the fraudulent debts, there was enough left to give me back most of what I'd lost. Not all of it, but enough to start over. Marcus had followed through on his promise to divorce Celine. He'd also cooperated fully with the investigation, providing additional evidence of her deceptions that even I hadn't known about. Apparently, she'd been forging my signature on some documents and had been planning to drain my savings account once she'd gained legal control over my finances. Patricia had pressed criminal charges, and Celine had eventually pleaded guilty to fraud and identity theft in exchange for a suspended sentence and community service. She'd avoided jail time, but her criminal record would follow her forever. The perfect life she'd tried so hard to build was gone, replaced by the reality she'd spent years running from. I picked up the letter that had arrived yesterday, still unopened on the small table beside my rocking chair. Celine's handwriting was as carefully controlled as ever, but I could see the slight tremor in the letters that spoke of stress and desperation. Inside were 3 pages of what she probably thought was an apology. I read through the familiar patterns, explanations for her behavior, justifications for her choices, promises that things would be different if only I'd give her another chance. But nowhere in those 3 pages did I find the words, "I was wrong," or "I'm sorry for hurting you." Instead, there were veiled accusations that I'd been too harsh, that family should forgive and forget, that she'd been under pressure I couldn't understand. Even in her attempt at reconciliation, she was still making me responsible for fixing what she'd broken. I folded the letter carefully and walked to the fire pit I'd had installed in my backyard. The flame caught the paper easily, turning Celine's words into ash and smoke that drifted away on the mountain breeze. There had been other letters over the past months, each one following the same pattern. Celine wanted back into my life, but only on her terms. She wanted forgiveness without accountability, reconciliation without change. She wanted me to go back to being the mother who paid for everything and expected nothing in return. But I wasn't that woman anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Eleanor, asking if I wanted to join her book club this afternoon. Eleanor was 72, had raised 5 children, and had the kind of no-nonsense wisdom that comes from decades of dealing with life's complications. She'd become a good friend over the past months, one of several women in town who'd welcomed me into their circle without asking questions about my past. I texted back that I'd be there, then went inside to get ready for my volunteer shift at the local animal shelter. It was something I'd never had time for when I was working multiple jobs to support Celine's lifestyle. Now I had time for things that mattered to me, things that brought joy instead of obligation. The shelter was a 15-minute walk from my cottage, through tree-lined streets where people actually waved to each other, and children played in front yards without supervision. It was the kind of community I'd always imagined living in, but never thought I could afford. At the shelter, I spent the morning socializing the older dogs that had been surrendered by families who couldn't care for them anymore. There was something healing about giving love to creatures who'd been abandoned, about proving that being discarded didn't mean being worthless. "Blanche," called Sarah, the shelter director, as I was getting ready to leave. "Someone called asking about you." My stomach clenched. "What kind of someone?" "A young woman. Said she was your daughter and wanted to know if you were volunteering here. I told her we don't give out information about our volunteers." I nodded, grateful for Sarah's discretion. "Thank you. If she calls again, please don't tell her anything." Sarah studied my face with the keen perception of someone who'd seen too many families torn apart by addiction, abuse, and neglect. She sounded desperate. I'm sure she did. That evening, as I was watering my tomato plants, a car pulled into my driveway. Through the garden gate, I could see it was a rental, which meant Celine had tracked me down, despite my efforts to keep my new address private. She got out of the car slowly, looking around at my cottage and garden with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was thinner than she'd been 6 months ago, dressed in clothes that looked expensive but somehow shabby, like designer pieces that had been worn too many times. "Hello, Mom." I continued watering my plants, not turning around. "How did you find me?" "I hired someone." Her voice was smaller than I remembered, less confident. "I needed to see you." "Why?" There was a long pause. "Because I miss you." I finally turned to face her, this woman who had once been my whole world, who had turned my love into a weapon against me. "You miss what I did for you, Celine. There's a difference." She flinched but didn't deny it. "Can I come in? Can we talk?" I considered it. Part of me, the part that had loved this person unconditionally for 35 years, wanted to invite her in, make her tea, listen to whatever new crisis had brought her to my door, but the larger part of me, the part that had spent 6 months learning to live without constant stress and manipulation, knew better. "We can talk here," I said, settling into one of the porch chairs I'd bought for myself. Celine climbed the porch steps hesitantly, like she was approaching a wild animal that might bolt. She perched on the edge of the other chair, her designer purse clutched in her lap like armor. "I've been going to therapy," she said finally. "Good. My therapist says I have abandonment issues from Dad dying when I was so young. She thinks that's why I've had trouble with boundaries and financial responsibility." I nodded but said nothing. I'd heard variations of this explanation before, external factors that made Celine's choices understandable, even forgivable, without requiring her to take actual responsibility for the pain she'd caused. "She thinks we should try family counseling, to work through our issues together." "What issues do you think we have, Celine?" She blinked, as if the question surprised her. "Well, the money thing, obviously, and communication. We've never been good at talking about difficult topics." I leaned back in my chair, studying this woman who still couldn't see past her own narrative. "Celine, do you remember what you said to Patricia on Mother's Day? About wishing she could be your real mother?" Her face flushed. "I was emotional. I didn't mean it the way it sounded." "How did you mean it?" She struggled for a moment, clearly not expecting to be pressed for specifics. "I meant that Patricia and I have a different kind of relationship. Less complicated." "Less complicated how?" She doesn't make me feel guilty all the time." And there it was. In Selena's mind, I was the problem for making her feel guilty about stealing from me. Patricia was easier to love because she'd never held Selene accountable for anything. "Celine," I said gently, "do you understand why I feel hurt by what you did?" She nodded quickly. "Of course, the money situation got out of hand. And I should have been more transparent about our finances. That's not what I'm talking about. Her brow furrowed. Then what? I looked at this person I'd raised, this woman who was approaching 40, but still couldn't see beyond her own needs, and I felt a profound sadness. Not for me, but for her. She was going to spend her entire life wondering why people pulled away from her, why relationships failed, why she felt empty despite getting everything she thought she wanted. I'm talking about being treated like I didn't matter, I said quietly. About being handed mortgage bills on Mother's Day while you gave expensive gifts to someone else. About you trying to have me declared incompetent so you could steal my life savings. About 35 years of love being treated like an inconvenience. Celine stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar defensiveness. I never tried to steal your life savings. That's not what the conservatorship was about. I stood up, suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Celine, I hope you find peace. I hope your therapy helps you understand why you hurt the people who love you. But I can't be part of that process. What do you mean? I mean, I'm done. I'm done being your emotional punching bag, your financial safety net, your convenient scapegoat. I'm done waiting for you to become the daughter I raised you to be. Her face went white. You're really cutting me off? Permanently? I'm choosing myself, I said simply. For the first time in 35 years, I'm choosing what's best for me instead of what's easiest for you. I watched her process this, saw the exact moment she realized that tears and manipulation and guilt trips weren't going to work anymore. She stood up slowly, her movements mechanical. This isn't fair, she said finally. No, I agreed. It's not fair that it took me this long to stand up for myself. She walked to her car without saying goodbye, and I watched her drive away without feeling the old urge to chase after her, to fix things, to make everything better at my own expense. As the sun set behind the mountains, I poured myself a glass of wine and called Eleanor to see if she wanted to join me for dinner. We talked about books and gardening and the art class we were both taking at the community center. We didn't talk about children or family obligations or the complexities of loving people who hurt you. For the first time in decades, my life was my own. I had friends who valued me for who I was, not what I could provide. I had hobbies and interests and time to pursue them. I had peace. That night, I sat in my garden listening to the crickets and watching fireflies dance among the flowers I'd planted. My phone remained silent. No urgent calls about bills or crises or emergencies that required my immediate financial intervention. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, the mother who would have given anything to make her daughter happy. That woman was gone, not through loss, but through choice. I'd finally learned the difference between love and enablement, between supporting someone and being consumed by them. Celine would survive without me. She'd find other people to manipulate, other sources of support, other targets for her special brand of emotional terrorism, but she'd do it without me. As for me, I was finally free to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs. At 64, I was just beginning to live for myself, and it was beautiful. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.